As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the U.S. weapons maker Lockheed Martin says that it is standing by to help Ukrainians fly and maintain F-16 fighter jets once NATO countries finalize their plans to provide Kiev with the aircraft. So Lockheed Martin is also ready to manufacture more F-16s to backfill the stockpiles of countries that ship their jets to Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has been a boon for Lockheed Martin as they make many of the weapon systems being poured into the conflict zone, including the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which is a big one. You know, they've sent thousands and thousands of them, I think 10,000 of those into Ukraine. And they also make the HIMARS rocket systems, which is also another big one. So this is Ukraine's ambassador to NATO. She told Politico that Kiev seeks some kind of invitation or at least a commitment to look at the time frame of their membership. She said that they're being realistic. They're not pushing to get membership right now, but they want some kind of commitment for when the war is over. But right now, you know, there's no end to this conflict in sight, and such a commitment to Ukraine, as we know, as we're always covering, you know, Russia's main thing, their main demand in the negotiations, and one of their biggest motives for invading Ukraine was Ukraine's alignment with NATO, was Ukrainian neutrality is what they want. So if NATO says, okay, once this war is over, then you can become a NATO member, you know, as long as Russia can keep fighting this funding and fighting this war, that's as long as it's going to go. You know, this is their thing. This is the main thing. This is what this is all about. So any kind of promise like that, I mean, it just guarantees war for, you know, a long time. All right. So the next one here, President Biden says that the threat of Putin using nukes is real. So President Biden said this on Monday, that the threat of Russian President Vladimir Putin using tactical nuclear weapons is real. And he made these comments to donors during a trip to California. And President Biden has previously recognized that the policy of the U.S. and NATO backing Ukraine against Russia risks nuclear war. In October 2022, he said that the chances of nuclear Armageddon were higher than at any point since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So despite recognizing that, he hasn't done anything to ease tensions since warning, you know, of nuclear Armageddon. I remember at the time I thought, oh, maybe this is a good sign because it shows he actually realizes the risks here. Maybe he's going to cool things down. But no, he's done nothing to ease tensions and continues to escalate U.S. involvement in the war, most recently by giving the okay for the F-16s. And Biden administration officials have also repeatedly expressed support for Ukrainian attacks on Crimea using U.S.-made weapons, and they're shrugging off these Ukrainian attacks inside Russia. There was a recent New York Times report that said earlier in the war, the Biden administration was worried that Ukrainian attacks in Russia could escalate the war. They were worried about Putin using a tactical nuke. Now they're not as worried. Apparently Biden, you know, thinks it's a real threat, though, but he's not going to do anything to change that. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said on Tuesday that the Russian military has information that shows Ukraine is plotting to attack Crimea with U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems and British-provided Storm Shadow cruise missiles. So Shoigu said, quote, according to our data, the leadership of the Ukrainian armed forces is planning to deliver strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation, including Crimea, with HIMARS and Storm Shadow missiles, end quote. So Shoigu warned that such strikes would make the U.S. and Britain direct parties to the conflict and warned of a potential response. He said, quote, the use of these missiles outside the zone of our special military operation would mean that the United States and Britain would be fully dragged into the conflict and would entail immediate strikes on decision-making centers in Ukraine, end quote. So while the Biden administration has said that it does not want Ukraine using U.S.-provided weapons on Russian territory, the restriction does not apply to Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014, and the people that live there want to be part of Russia. You know, they're not asking to be liberated by the Ukrainians. They want to stay in Russia. So if the claims about the training facility are true, Beijing's efforts would clearly be a response to the U.S. building up militarily in areas near China. And this is something that the Wall Street Journal report recognized. The report said, quote, U.S. intelligence officials say that Beijing sees its actions in Cuba as a geographical response to the U.S. relationship with Taiwan. The U.S. invests heavily in arming and training the self-governing island that sits off mainland China and that Beijing sees as its own, end quote. So Taiwan is roughly 100 miles from the coast of mainland China, which is about the same distance Cuba is from Florida. So this report, I want to read the quote just because it's interesting, you know, to see the Wall Street Journal actually including this. It said, quote, China has no combat forces in Latin America, according to U.S. officials, Meanwhile, the U.S. has dozens of military bases throughout the Pacific where it stations more than 350,000 troops, end quote. So, the Pacific is a pretty broad region, but still, the U.S. has a major military presence near China, and China has nothing comparable to that near the U.S. So, of course, all the China hawks are in a frenzy over this again. So she said that if the present state of U.S. discourse continued, China would probably never agree to resume military-to-military communications. And these are channels that China suspended after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. So her trip, her reckless, trip for a photo op, it sparked the largest ever Chinese military drills around Taiwan. And the effects of it are still being felt now as China has kept up the military pressure on Taiwan and, has kept these dialogues suspended. So I think it's interesting. And, that's kind of what I've been thinking is that all the U.S. is saying is, oh, we want to talk. We got to talk. Talking's good, right? Which I agree. Talking is good. It's good that there is dialogue at least happening at some levels, but they're not talking about really changing things or resolving issues between the two sides. So Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan met with his Iranian counterpart in Tehran on Saturday and signaled that Riyadh is open to a naval alliance with Tehran, an idea that was recently put forward by Iran's Navy chief. So Prince Faisal said at a joint press conference with Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian, Faisal said, quote, "I would like to point out the importance of cooperation between our two countries concerning the regional security, especially the security of maritime navigation and waterways," end quote. So Iran's Navy commander said earlier this month that Iran was working to form a naval alliance with regional countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Iraq. So the potential maritime coalition goes against U.S. and Israeli plans for the region. They want to form an anti-Iran alliance between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. But this Iran-Saudi normalization really got in the way of things here. Iran's foreign minister said that that he discussed with Faisal increasing cooperation in all areas, including security, and he stressed Iran's view that regional security will be ensured by regional actors only without external interference, and that is a clear reference to the U.S. And this increased cooperation, of course, comes after this surprise China-brokered normalization deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Faisal said, quote, "Our relations are based on a clear foundation of full and mutual respect for independence, sovereignty, and non-interference in internal affairs," end quote.
The Peter Schiff Show.
And just think about what will happen. Let's say interest rates just stay around 5%. I think they're headed higher, even if they dip a little bit first. I think 5% is going to look low at some point. But let's just say rates stay around 5%. The national debt is going to be 40 trillion in a few more years, right? Not that many. At 5%, because by the time the national debt is 40 trillion, the whole thing would have rolled over. There'll be no more of that, 25 basis point debt on the Fed's balance sheet or on the government's balance sheet anymore. It'll all be gone. So if you figure the government ends up paying 5% on a $40 trillion national debt, that's $2 trillion a year in interest. That is more than triple the current $600 billion. That's more than we spend on Medicaid right now. That's more than we spend on Social Security. It's actually about what we spend on Social Security and national defense combined. And that's just interest. That's $2 trillion. But another very troubling fact should be that even if we could balance the budget without interest, meaning that the government collected enough in taxes to pay its bills, not counting interest. Even if the government could do that, we would still have a deficit of $2 trillion a year, which it can't. If you look right now, federal tax revenue is about 4.7 trillion. Spending is 6.3 trillion. Even if you subtract the 600 billion for interest on the national debt, you still have an operating deficit of $1 trillion. Even if there was no national debt and no interest to pay, we still have $1 trillion deficit, budget deficit every year, adding to the national debt. So that means if the government can maintain that $1 trillion deficit, which I doubt it can do, it's about to skyrocket as the economy, collapses into recession, or a deeper recession than what we got now. But even if we can maintain that, that means when interest on the debt is $2 trillion, the annual budget deficits will be $3 trillion a year. I mean, this is, going ballistic. Clearly, an accident is about to happen. We cannot continue this. And so this is a fiscal powder keg. All it needs is a fuse, and it's going to go off. And I think it's got to be this next downturn that is coming. I mean, the global economy, everybody is feeling the impact of rising interest rates. Right? We're in like the lull before the storm. Although there was news over the weekend out of China, the Chinese economy growth is slowing, unemployment is picking up. In fact, they even had some rate cuts already in China, right, to try to stimulate the economy. Right, this is just the beginning. But these problems are worldwide because of 12 years of artificially low interest rates and the malinvestments and bubbles and debt that were a byproduct of that era. As rates have been allowed to rise, all of those mistakes are rising to the surface, and we're just beginning to experience the consequences. And when you look at what just happened with the deficit and the suspension of the debt ceiling, the creditors are figuring this out. The de-dollarization is not just about the sanctions on Russia. It's also about the enormity of the debt and the fact that our creditors want out. They don't want to be aboard this ship when it sinks. A lot of people are under the false impression, due to revisionist history, that America was like, last to the, abolishing slavery party, that we were dragging our feet and every other country abolished slavery and we were like one of the last to do it. And that's just not true. I mean, Americans were leading the charge to abolish slavery. I mean, even going back to before the birth of the nation, while we were still colonies, there was a lot of movement. In fact, the state of Vermont, and before it was a state, it was just a territory, abolished slavery in 1777. So that was before we had the United States. It was a territory. And they abolished slavery. And of course, a lot of the delegates to the convention that voted for independence, a lot of those guys would have liked to have abolished slavery. They just didn't have enough support because they needed the support of the southern states, and slavery was important to the southern states. And so in order to have a unified Declaration of Independence from the Crown, they had to put those anti-slavery concerns on the back burner. But that doesn't mean they didn't have them, because they did. But also, I mentioned that Vermont abolished slavery in 1777, but Pennsylvania did it in 1780. New Hampshire and Massachusetts in 1783. Connecticut, my state that I'm in now, and Rhode Island in 1784. New Jersey in 1804, and New York in 1817. Britain didn't abolish slavery until 1833. And all these people on Twitter are saying, oh, Great Britain was 1833, and we waited until 1863 or 1865. That's the entire United States. That's not individual states, because back in those days, the states had a lot more sovereignty than they do today. We really were United Nation states, united under a common federal government, but the state government was far more important. The nature of the country is very different. And so it was very significant that you had individual states abolishing slavery. I mean, when America was first formed, it was a little bit more like the European Union. Yes, if you're French, if you're Italian, if you're German, you're in the EU, but you still identify more with your country than the European Union. And that was what it was like prior to the Civil War. And so to ignore the fact that these states were leading the charge in abolishing slavery. France didn't abolish it until 1848. What took them so long?
The First Amendment, I think, is founded on truth. The Establishment Clause, which actually prevents the establishment of a single religion in the United States, was all about actually protecting, instead, paving the way for free speech and open debate, also included in the First Amendment. So I think part of this is woven into our Constitution because it's a theory about the pursuit of truth itself. The path to truth runs through free speech and open debate. That's how we do it on Earth. In a divine kingdom of heaven, it may reveal itself in a different way, but on Earth, when we live in the world that you and I live in currently, Dr. Paul, we sort that out. The last best path that we have to get there is free speech and open debate. And right. I think that is enshrined in our Constitution. And so in many ways, that's what motivates me in this campaign. Just to bring it to a practical level, one of the things that I'm doing in this campaign is speaking the truth, at least my beliefs, unapologetically. And if that's the right political strategy, great. It'll be for the people of this country to decide, and I'll be the next president of the United States in January 2025. But I would rather lose that election and still speak what the truth is at every step of the way than to play some political snakes and ladders. And I think that's part of what's actually had gotten the energy behind this campaign to get it off the ground in the early days.
Yeah, the more I think about this, the more I go further back I go from the beginning of time, because if you go back to the original ideas that humans talked about, it was a seeking of truth that motivated them.
One of the things that we're going to share in common, I believe, I'm not saying this to flatter you, but just so you have the factual backdrop, I was kind of one of your super fans back when, you were in this game back in the mid to late 2000s. I graduated from college in 2007, and back then I used to call myself a libertarian. I can tell you why I call myself more of a conservative today, but I think we're cut from similar cloths, that if there's one thing I want to do as the next U.S. president, I'm thinking about January 2033 when I'm leaving office. What do I want to be saying that we accomplished? Number one on the list is that we will in this country once again have 3 branches of government, not 4. I think that fourth branch, the rise of that fourth branch, is I think the number one obstacle to the realization of the American dream itself, to the realization of the ideals enshrined in our Constitution, including the main filter that distorts our pursuit of the truth as well. So I don't believe, Dr. Paul, that all solutions are going to be delivered by government. In fact, I believe that most will hopefully not be delivered through government. My background is as an entrepreneur. I built a biotech company. That was my first career. In my most recent career, I've been pushing back against some of the orthodoxies that we see in the marketplace, like the rise of the ESG movement, through offering market alternatives, which is the first best choice. But there are certain things that I am not in a position to do through the private sector, that I'm not in a position to do through writing books or starting businesses. And the top of the list is, I think, actually restoring a 3-branch constitutional republic. And yes, I think that's also the biggest threat to federalism itself, is that fourth branch in the federal government. It's a threat to separation of powers, and it's a threat to federalism. And if there's one thing that motivates me in this race, one thing that I'm going to deliver, it's to revive the national identity of our constitutional republic by restoring those 3 branches. And that's something I think the next U.S. president can do. And that's something that I think we probably share in common as a passion. I'm not 100% sure on that. We haven't spoken before.
Right.
But that's something that I'm in this to actually deliver, and I think we can get done.
Oh, very good.
Really a delight to speak with you. Obviously very successful and intelligent, and there are a lot of libertarians that are interested in what you have to say. Now, I'm not a wealthy man. You're a very successful entrepreneur. Occasionally I do find a couple quarters under the couch, but we heard from the Pentagon yesterday that they actually looked under the couch and found $6 billion, $6.2 billion that they meant to send to Ukraine, and they didn't send it to Ukraine. You tweeted out, I think earlier, if anyone else had done this, they'd be in prison. So they found this money. It sounds really great, a little bit of a windfall. They want to send it to Ukraine. You think that's a good idea?
I think it's an awful idea. I think that we have gotten into a bad habit in this country of fighting politically correct wars, and this is the politically correct war of our time. I don't think there should be such a thing as a politically correct war. War itself is a thing that we should actually avoid, unless in the rare circumstance that it ever is required to protect Americans here on American soil. So what I've said as U.S. president is, not only would I end the Ukraine war and stop the bleeding of the money, I think that much would be good, but I also want to use this as an opportunity. I'm an optimist. I believe in using every silver lining we're given, even in the mistakes that we've made, to our advantage. I want to end the Ukraine war on terms that also stop us from ever going to war with China over Taiwan. What does that mean? That sounds like maybe a crazy man talking. Let me explain that to you, because neither political party is talking about this, and I think it's achievable. I think it's achievable because Vladimir Putin does not enjoy being Xi Jinping's little brother. Yet he is in a military partnership with China. The 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Cooperation, they called it, and also the 2022 No Limits Partnership. They're in a military alliance with one another. That's why China, per those treaties, is coming to Russia's aid to now fight Ukraine. Here's the deal I would do with Putin. I would say we would stop this war. We're done with it. Okay, we don't want this to be another Vietnam or an Iraq. We've gotten into the bad habit of endless, pointless wars. This is another one of them brewing as we speak. Put an end to it. But I'm going to put an end to it on terms that actually get us even more out of this, which is that Putin, in return for us freezing the current lines of control, in return for us committing, as I believe we should, that Ukraine will not be admitted to NATO, Putin has to, most importantly, I'll ask a few other things of him too, move the nuclear weapons out of Kaliningrad, get the Russian military out of Cuba and Venezuela, and out of the Western Hemisphere. But the most important thing I'll demand he gets done is he exits that military partnership with China. That restores now a trilateral international order where none of the 3 major nuclear superpowers are allied, rather than the bilateral one that exists today. So the conventional wisdom is, if Vladimir Putin takes over any territory, that's going to embolden Xi Jinping to go after Taiwan. That is wrong. The real thing that emboldens Xi Jinping to go for Taiwan is his military partnership with Russia, because Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world and hypersonic missile capabilities ahead of the United States. What we should be doing is pulling Russia out of China's camp, and we can do that if we end the Ukraine war by saying that we're not sending any more money, no NATO membership for Ukraine. Those are big wins in Putin's eyes, but we get a bigger win in return, which is we pull Russia out of China's camp. And I think it's going to take that kind of foreign policy vision to restore peace, pull America out of these pointless wars, but in a way that, yes, does advance American interests first, not just by having our head in the sand and preaching first principles. I am driven by first principles, but I'm also a believer in translating that into pragmatism, and we have an opportunity to do it. It disappoints me that we don't have a single presidential candidate in either major political party talking about that right now. And I believe I have the vision here and the commitment to actually be able to deliver on that pretty quickly in my first term as president.
I was drafted, and I know all about that. But all they talked about, when was it going to end? When was it going to end? And we elect a president and he doesn't end it. It just goes on and on. I want to know what you think about what major change in the philosophy of our foreign policy could keep us from getting involved so that we don't have these details, because you have good ideas on how you do it, and I'm sure you could have done a better job than they did coming home from Afghanistan or Vietnam or all these places. But what we try to do at the Institute is find ways to get people to understand you're already in the war when you're leading up to war. And do you have any ideas on that, how to go back one step to not get engaged? And you have good ideas about how to disengage, but I'm thinking about it hasn't worked. So I'm trying to get people to think, let's stay out of that mess. Why do we have to go so far looking for a war?
Sir, the idealistic answer is have more people go back and read George Washington's farewell address after his term in office. I mean, it's a beautiful statement of what I think of as the original America First vision. I call myself a George Washington America First conservative, not engaging abroad without actually having American interests at issue. That was the original vision. We would do well to remember it.
I had a question. Now, you got a lot of mileage, and deservedly so, out of just coming out and saying, you know what, I would pardon Trump immediately as president. I think that's a great statement. But I'm looking at we have a very lively live chat, and we're grateful to them. But they're all interested, and that sounds great, they say. But what about Assange and Snowden? How do you feel about that?
Pardon. And I've been very clear about that. And you want any good answer of even bringing people along on this who might disagree with me? Assange sits in foreign exile. And by the way, I might ask for some of your listeners or yourselves on help. I've had a lot of trouble with this. I'm trying to visit Julian Assange. Actually, I have a planned trip to the UK that I'd committed to speak at something in September. I want to see him during that visit and face-to-face have that conversation. So if there's anybody in your network, they're making it really hard to see him. But that's something that I'm keen to do.
We can help you with that.
Yeah, I would hope so, given I would take it gladly. I intend to pardon him. Because even the people who disagree with me, they have nothing to say to me on this. Chelsea Manning, the government employee who leaked the information to Assange, who just merely published it, actually had her sentence commuted by President Obama because she's a member of a favorable political class. Let's call the truth what it is. She's transgender. I think that we should not have the two tiers, and this is nothing against anti-trans comment or anything like that. It's just a statement of how the federal police state works. There's two tiers of justice, or multiple tiers of justice. An intersectionality-based theory of justice. Based on how high or low you are in the intersectional pyramid, there's now not only a different claim on economic goods, there's now a different claim on justice itself. Antifa treated one way. Peaceful protesters of a different persuasion treated a different way. Chelsea Manning treated one way. Julian Assange treated another. Trump one way, Biden another. Enough with it. We have to have one rule of law grounded in the Constitution we wrote, that set this nation into motion almost 250 years ago. That's what we need to revive today.
Now, just to make it a little worse, the two things I said that the Greeks were primarily concerned with at this early stage was change and multiplicity. Well, having denied change, Parmenides went on with apparently equal consistency to deny multiplicity. There is no multiplicity. There are no variety of things. Why? Well, he, like everybody at this early period, was a monist. And remember, a monist means somebody who believes there's only one stuff which makes up the world. But in addition, he believes that the world is a plenum, solidly packed. There are no spaces. Well, then he asked, what in the world would make one thing different from anything else? How would you draw a line and say, here's one thing and here's another? The world is one solid, undifferentiated slab of one stuff which has no spaces between it. So there's nothing to separate one thing from another thing. We have to therefore say that multiplicity is an illusion. The world is just a hunk of undifferentiated stuff. There's nothing to distinguish one part from the other Again, there are no entities. Or putting it another way, there's just one entity, everything, which he called the one, and you can see why. See, it's no longer the one in the many, because the many are gone now. It's just the one. Now that, believe it or not, is the ancestor of the Christian God. By several transmutations and permutations, Parmenides I became the God of Christianity, but it took quite a while for it to happen. So the world is simply a motionless, changeless, undifferentiated ball of tightly packed matter. Now, needless to say, this is not the way it appears to our senses. It appears as though there is multiplicity. It appears as though there's change. What is Parmenides' answer? Same as Heraclitus. Senses are deceptive. They give us only the world of appearances, which is not true reality. True reality is the motionless one, and it is arrived at by logic, not by the senses, by reason, as he interpreted reason. And therefore, again, we have rationalism epistemologically. Parmenides, like Heraclitus, only coming to the opposite conclusion.